Hello, I'm Elaine Smith, the Artistic Director of the Clamour Theater Company. We're holding these creative conversations with playwrights, with actors, with directors, so that you can find out more about Clamour Theater and about the artists who work with us. So welcome to this edition of a Clamour Creative Conversation. Today, we're talking with Danielle Wirsansky, whose play Sitting Still was part of Clay and Water 2019, our very first annual Playwrights retreat, or at least Act 1 of it was part of that retreat. And then we read the full script last year in our ongoing virtual reading series. So welcome, Danielle. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So please introduce yourself to our viewers by telling them a little bit about yourself, your bio, your background, any awards or hobbies or anything you'd like us to know.
Sure. So I do a lot of different things. So I have a very varied background. I am a playwright and I consider myself a storyteller primarily, first and foremost, above all else. But I love playwriting and theater, and I also am a photographer as well. And I also love history, which ties in really, really well with my love of theater and playwriting. And I've been doing playwriting since I was very, very young. I became a theater major in the fourth grade, and I never really turned back. And as I got into college, I found myself almost primarily just only writing about historical people and places and events. And a lot of the time I was writing about sensitive periods in history like the Holocaust, because Holocaust education is very important to me. And I decided if I was going to keep writing about these things, I needed to go the extra mile in my dramaturgical research. And I decided to get a master's in history, which was really just an extreme form of dramaturgy at that point. And it really, really cemented that love of history that I have too. And I'm actually going to be starting my studies for my PhD in history this fall, which I'm really excited about. And I love history, and I study modern European history because I prefer to use my studies as a platform for Holocaust education. But I also use public history, which is instead of historians talking to other historians, public history is historians talking to the community. And I'm really passionate about using theater as a platform for public history. So educating about all periods of history, whether that's the Holocaust or other areas as well. So that's just a little bit about me.
Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit about the play Sitting Still that we read, and tell us just a little bit about it and where it stands now. Has it had additional rewrites, any other readings, anything on the horizon for it, or is it still waiting in the wings?
So my play Sitting Still that I brought to Clay and Water is about four women doctors during World War I that were British, either English or Scottish. And they were real women: Elsie Inglis, Flora Murray, Louisa Garrett Anderson, Jessica McGregor, and they were all very notable women. And what they're best known for, the impact that they made, was they were the first to create all women medical units that went abroad into the war effort. So Flora and Louisa were in France for a majority of the war, whereas Elsie had her own unit that she had in Serbia. And what I think is really interesting about these women, they're so strong and they've done so much, and that very little is well known about them. But another element that I was really intrigued by was the fact that they were all queer, and that queer history is often, brushed under the rug. And so there's evidence that there was this love triangle between Elsie and Louisa and Flora, and not to diminish any of their achievements by focusing on their love lives, but I wanted to show this queer history and how it's always been there and how it's affected and shaped history, these queer relationships. Because even now, a lot of historians won't acknowledge their relationships. So Louisa and Flora were together for a long time and they were married. And when they died, their gravestones, they were buried side by side, and the gravestone said, "We were gloriously happy." And historians are like, no, they're just friends. Um, so I was really inspired by their story and I really wanted to bring it to light. So that's what it's about. And I've definitely done rewriting since the first retreat, and even since it had its reading again last year. The pandemic was actually a really great time for me in regards to being able to do so many virtual readings, having the time and the resource and the access to actors virtually. And it had a bunch of different readings. It was read by Expansive Theater Workshop and Up Here Productions, and it was the Dramatists Guild Florida Footlights piece in 2020.
Right.
And this year it was turned into a podcast reading by Theater Viscera, which is a queer theater in the Northwest.
Okay, great. Well, that's good. I'm glad to see that it's continuing its journey. That's terrific. So now tell me, do you have a favorite play of your own, whether it's produced or unproduced?
I do have well, it's actually not a play, but a musical that I wrote.
Okay.
And it's kind of like my white whale. I've been thinking about it since 2011 when I was a senior in high school. And I used to scan Yahoo News for interesting articles to spark my inspiration for different plays. And I saw this article that was about the fake Paris of World War One, and I thought that was super interesting. And I'll try to really nutshell it, but basically, during World War One, France was really scared of Paris being bombed by the Germans, so they came up with a top secret plan to build a fake Paris 15 miles north of the real one. And it was all about how it was illuminated at night. So at that range, the navigators, depending on the eyesight and the topography, would all look the same from a bird's eye view. So they were really hoping that the fake Paris would be bombed instead of the real one. And I thought that was so interesting and so fascinating. But at that point, anyways, I didn't study World War One. I studied World War Two, and I was like, well, how can I talk about this story in a World War II context? Well, the reason that no one ever knew that the fake Paris existed is because it didn't get torn down until 1961, which means it was still standing during World War II, even though it was abandoned. And I had to think about that. The reason it didn't get released or people didn't know about it until 2011 is that the French government makes information sit for 50 years before it can be declassified. So it was released in 2011 to the National Archives, and a wily reporter came across it, and that's how he knew. And that story just really stuck with me. And when I was in college, I won several grants in order to go to Paris and do my own research and see where the fake Paris had stood. And I ended up being able to write a play and then a musical. That was my undergraduate thesis, called City of Light. And it's two children who they were held in a French internment camp, and they escape and they try to flee to Paris for safety, but they end up in the wrong Paris. Um, and it's really my favorite piece I've ever written. It got produced in a workshop in 2016 at FSU. And I haven't touched it since then, even though it's really been sitting on my mind and on my chest and on my shoulders. And I just recently reconnected with my composer, and we're starting to look at it again. And I'm really, really excited for it.
Oh, that's great. Good. Is that one on NPX or no?
I don't think it is, actually, because of I'm not proud of my draft anymore, so I've put it
Okay.
back into a good state.
Yep. Okay. Well, I'll look forward to it when it does emerge. So now here's one of the questions I like to ask everybody is, what are three favorite plays whether you've seen them or read them by other authors, and what is it that you like about them?
Sure. One play that so what I think is my favorite play, and I've only read it, I've never seen it yet, is called When the Rain Stops Falling by Andrew Bovell. And it's this really, I like dramas. I like being sad. Um, I like pieces that have to do with like history of oh, I always love history and that make you feel things about it. So and When the Rain Stops Falling, it's set in Australia and it spans across four different generations and shows you all these connections between the generations that the generations aren't even aware of, and this loss and trauma and how events affect future generations. And it's really profound. I also really like King Charles III, which I was really fortunate enough to see when it was in the West End. I got to see it in 2015, and it was so interesting and so realistic and thought-provoking that sometimes I forget. So King Charles III is what happens when Queen Elizabeth dies and King Charles takes the throne. Prince Charles takes the throne and becomes the king. And it's this speculation on what would happen. And it's so I forget that the queen hasn't died and Prince Charles hasn't become the king, and what happens after I forget sometimes, or I get confused. So a piece of theater is really good when you start to think that it was real, that it was what actually happened. um, and another piece that I really really loved that I got to see at the Royal Court Theater was How to Hold Your Breath by Zinni Harris. And every year, with every, I guess, disaster that comes by us, I remember this story. I was so strongly affected by it after the performance. I remember waiting. I was on the tube going home, and as soon as I got home, I just started crying because I couldn't hold it in anymore because I felt so much from it. And it's about what happens in Europe when there's a societal collapse, a big disaster, and what a young woman has to do to survive and to get through it all. So those are three of the pieces that first come to mind for me.
Okay, that's great. I'm keeping notes on all of what everybody's saying, and my reading list is getting longer and longer and longer. And that's not a bad thing. So that's good. So this is great. So for our viewers, if you would like to read plays by Danielle, you can look for them on the New Play Exchange at newplayexchange.org. And if you are interested in Clamour Theater Company news and events, check out our website at clamourtheater.org. And you can find us on Facebook as Clamour Theater Company. We will post all of those URLs in the description below. And of course, if you'd like to see more interviews like this one, please hit the like button and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Danielle, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today and letting our viewers get to know something about you and your work. And we are so glad you have been able to become part of the Clamour crowd.
I'm so glad to be a part of it. It's been
That's
such a pleasure every year.
great. Thank you very much.